Hey, Science 30s, and welcome to the second half of our chemistry in the environment unit. This will be chapter 2 of unit B, chemical legacy of human activity. Boy, what a mouthful. Really, that chapter should be entitled organic chemistry because that's what we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be dealing with different types of organic molecules that are in large part being released by humans that are again wreaking havoc on ecosystems, very much like we talked about in the first half. We were talking about our contribution to acid deposition. Now we're going to discuss some other molecules that are being released, and some of these we've already talked about already. Fossil fuels, for example, we've been talking about quite a bit already. Fossil fuels fall into this category of organic chemistry or organic molecules. So we're going to get to all of that in this section of videos. One thing you want to keep in mind, you want to be on page 9 of your data sheet, because everything we need for this particular chapter is going to be on that single page 9 of the data sheet. All right, let's discuss, we'll get started with topic 2.1 today. We're going to break this into 3 parts, this section, because it is a fairly meaty section. There's a lot of material in this 2.1 section, so we'll be discussing this over the course of the next 3 videos. But we'll be discussing organic compounds. What's an organic compound? What makes up an organic compound? What is it by definition? And what are some of the classifications of organic compounds, which we'll be discussing throughout this half of the unit. All right, so what's an organic compound to start off with? Well, an organic compound is any molecule that contains carbon. Now, you may remember this from Science 9, because this was discussed in Science 9. There are a couple of exceptions to the carbon rule, and a couple just to keep in mind: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, even though they contain carbon in those molecules, are not generally considered to be organic compounds. But pretty much any other compound out there that has carbon in it, that is going to be an organic compound. Example, how about C6H12O6, glucose, right? Sugars. Lipids are going to be in there. All these macromolecules, proteins, nucleic acids are in there. They all contain carbon as sort of a starting point. Now, carbon is sort of the backbone for all these organic molecules. And I would get you to watch this really quick video right over here just to kind of go through the chemistry of carbon. Why does carbon do what it does? And again, for this unit, what I would recommend you know is this: is that carbon binds to 4 substances. When carbon has all of its binding sites full, there's going to be 4 molecules or 4 bonds that are going to be associated with any carbon. And as we go through our naming of aromatics, our naming of aliphatic, halogenated hydrocarbons, esters, carboxylic acids, and alcohols, whenever you see a carbon molecule in any, or an atom in any of these molecules, they're all going to be bound with 4 bonds to them. So that's sort of a way to know if the carbon is, fully saturated. Does it have all its binding sites and bonding sites in play? The magic number with carbon is always going to be 4, and I'll get to that more, probably more in the next video, our part 2 look at organic compounds, when I talk about alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. But I will mention a little bit today when it comes to aromatics as well. So what are some of the groups of organic molecules? We're going to be discussing 5, as I've mentioned, actually 6. There's going to be 2 groups of hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons are what we're going to start our conversation with today and into our next video. Hydrocarbons are essentially organic compounds that contain nothing but carbon and hydrogen. Methane, CH4. Gasoline would be in this category. Ethane, propane, butane. Benzene is what we'll be discussing today. These are all molecules that contain only carbon and hydrogen in them, and for that reason we give them the name hydrocarbons. And we've already been discussing hydrocarbons. They are a very common form of fuel in combustion reactions. Fossil fuels, a lot of them are going to be these hydrocarbons. And as you already well know, they cause a little bit of issues with greenhouse gas emissions, acid deposition, as we discussed in the first half of this unit. So hydrocarbons are broken into 2 main groups, and we're going to be discussing the first group today, and then we'll be discussing the second group in the next video, the part 2 video of organic compounds in our next video. But there are 2 groups of hydrocarbons that you should be familiar with. There are aromatic compounds and there are aliphatic compounds. I'll quickly talk about aliphatics right now, because that'll be the majority of our discussion next time. Aliphatics are chained. They are hydrocarbons that form chains. So you can have three different types of aliphatics, which I'll be discussing more about in the next video. but you've got alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. Alkanes, just very simply, have nothing but single bonds in them. Alkenes are going to have some double bonds in those chains, and alkynes are going to have some triple bonds. So that's the difference between alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. Again, more about those in our next video. Today, though, I want to concentrate on aromatics. Aromatic compounds are not chained hydrocarbons, they are ringed hydrocarbons. These are hydrocarbons that form into ring structures. And an example, probably the best one that you should be familiar with when it comes to aromatics is benzene. Benzene, which has the chemical formula C6H6, and it has a molecular structure of a 6-ringed carbon molecule. And it's going to have alternating single and double bonds. So there's going to be a double bond between these two carbons, then a single, then a double, then a single, then a double. And then each of the carbons has one hydrogen attached to it. If you look at each carbon, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines attached to it. Those are my magic number of 4. There's my 4 bonding sites on that carbon. This carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4. 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 So they all have 4 bonding sites attached to them. And remember, the double bond in this case counts as 2 bonding sites. So I'm just counting the lines. And in this case, all the lines are there. I've got 4 bonds to each of my carbon atoms, as you saw in that video that I asked you to watch a little earlier in the lesson. Benzene, very toxic, but it's also very stable. It doesn't tend to break down easily, and this is an issue because we've discussed this already in the first half of the unit. This is an issue with what we call biomagnification or bioaccumulation. This is a poison that if it gets into a food chain, into a water supply, food chain, into an ecosystem, it's going to stick around. It's not going anywhere. Organisms that consume it really can't break it down, and then we get that accumulation of the poison as we move up a food chain. Benzene can be drawn as a chemical formula. Obviously, it can be written as an expanded formula, as you see here. But one of the best ways to describe these hydrocarbons, and I'm going to use these diagrams a lot in the next few videos, is going to be what we call skeletal formulas. And the skeletal formula there's 2 examples, there's actually 3 examples up here of skeletal formulas of benzene. In this case, the C's are not listed. We just assume that the diagram is going to be connecting the dots between C's, and any substance that is attached to the C, if it's not shown, is going to be taken as a hydrogen. So in this case, I've got my carbon, my carbon, my carbon, my carbon, my carbon. I got 6 carbons, pardon me. I've got a double bond, double bond, double bond, single bond, single bond, single bond, pretty much representing what we see there. And because I know I've got 1, 2, 3 bonding sites to each of those carbons in the diagram, I intuitively understand that the 4th bonding site, even though it isn't being shown, is going to be a hydrogen. But we don't have to show the hydrogen in the skeletal formula. Just saves us a lot of time. Now, benzene, because of its ring structure, sometimes you can show it like this, or you can show it like this, right? Depending on how the molecule is oriented, which bonds are where. There really is no way to determine exactly the look of a benzene ring because they can move around, right? They can spin around. And also the bonds can move around. The bonds actually move from if this is, and we do number carbons in molecular diagrams in organic chemistry. So that's carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Technically, in this case, I've got a double bond between carbons 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. However, in this case, my bonds are not between 1 and 2. My bonds are between 2 and 3, and 4 and 5, and 6 and 1. Because of that, we can describe benzene with a circle on the inside. That circle indicates something called resonance, which means that the molecule is always in states of flux between which double bonds are where in the molecule. And that's whenever you see that circle inside that hexagon, that's pretty much the textbook skeletal diagram of a benzene molecule. Now, benzene, as I mentioned, hangs around in the environment. It's very stable. Benzene used to be a really major component in gasoline. Not so much anymore, but back in the day, old gasolines had lots of benzene in them. And a lot of old gas stations, when they become decommissioned, you got to really take care that you don't actually have that gasoline kind of leach into the ground and then actually become part of the water table and then actually get moved into the ecosystem. So you may remember that even very recently, the Husky in Morinville was torn down over by the rail tracks there by the grain elevator. When they removed the Husky, they actually had to go underground, and they dug quite a big pit. I actually walked by it a couple of times when they were removing them. They were removing the gas tanks underneath the, um, the former gas station. They had to make sure that the ground was actually not saturated with, potentially any forms of old gasoline as part of the cleanup of that site before a new building or new property can be put on top of that site. So this is an issue, especially with old gasoline forms, and this benzene, if it gets into the ecosystem, could be a problem. Benzene today is mainly found in cigarette smoke. It is a known carcinogen. It causes leukemia, causes bone cancer. It can be found in your heart. It can be found in your brain, your lungs, your liver, your kidneys, and it's a physical mutagen. We talked about mutagens in the first unit, Unit A, and the second half of that unit with genetics. These are mutagens that basically physically break apart DNA, physically shred it. They don't chemically react with the DNA, but they break it apart, and that could do some major damage, and that's why it can be considered a form of cancer, or it can cause forms of cancer because of that ability to physically damage and potentially even destroy DNA. Very, very nasty stuff, this benzene. So this benzene, because of this fact that it's a highly toxic poison, and the fact that it's very stable, we give it a name. We give it a name called POP, or an acronym called POP. This means persistent organic pollutants. So there's a whole pile of these substances. As you're going to be finding out in this unit, there's a lot of other organic compounds that humans produce that are also classified as persistent organic pollutants. They're any pollutant that basically has carbon in it because it's organic, and it's persistent because it doesn't break down. So how do you get rid of these? Well, in grade 9 science, you learned about this as well back in the day, and you probably don't remember it, but you talked about something called phytoremediation, or in this case, we're just going to refer to it as remediation. Remediation is a way to take these stable organic molecules that are not breaking down, and we can break them down using bacteria. We can use soil bacteria that actually basically eat the benzene and these other persistent organic pollutants and eat them for lunch. So it's difficult because there aren't a lot of bacteria that can actually break these very stable molecules down. But there are some bacteria out there that can do it. So we can use bacteria if this stuff gets into the environment, into the ground, into the soil. We can use bacteria in the soil, specific types of bacteria in the soil, to break it down through a process called remediation. Now, one last thing about aromatics before I finish up today. If you have multiple rings of benzene side by side, then you've got what's called a PAH. PAH is the acronym. It's a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. Polycyclic meaning there's multiple rings. Aromatic meaning that's the name of the ring. This ring goes by another name. It goes by actually two other names. You can call this a benzene ring, or you can call it an aromatic ring because it's named after the aromatic compound, right? Or you can call it a phenyl ring. So there's a benzene ring, aromatic ring, or phenyl ring, all pretty much mean the same thing because that's the ring structure that forms the benzene molecule. So in this case, I've got polycyclic, so multiple benzene rings that are aromatic in configuration, and they're hydrocarbons because they only have hydrogen and carbon in them. So these PAHs are found are produced through incomplete combustion. We've talked about a lot of other substances that are produced through incomplete combustion. We talked about carbon monoxide in the first half of the unit, but these PAHs are produced particularly. There's a great source of them in your home or in your yard. Barbecues. When you barbecue food, when you don't burn the materials on the barbecue 100%, you get that char on the meat. That is actually possibly part of that is actually these PAHs that are in there. So they say that you shouldn't be charring your meat too much when you're on a barbecue. They say use a low heat to avoid that char because you produce fewer of these PAHs on your food. And these PAHs are unfortunately linked to being, they're mutagens. They are considered to be mutagens of DNA just like benzene is. And there can be some ramifications of increased use of these substances or consumption of these substances if you perhaps barbecue a lot or like your meat really, really charred. That's our discussion for today. That's our introduction. We discussed aromatics today. Next day, we're going to sit down and we're going to discuss the different types of aliphatic. We're going to be discussing how to name and how to classify alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. For this video, pretty easy homework on this one. I want you to answer questions 3 and 4 on page 247 of the Science 30 textbook. That is our discussion on aromatics and our introduction to organic compounds. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time for our discussion about aliphatic.